The gun barrel pressed cold and hard against Grant Monroe's temple, and he had exactly 3 seconds to understand that he was going to die in a cellar that smelled like old gunpowder and rotting timber. "End of the line, deputy," said Calhoun Briggs, and his voice carried the satisfied weight of a man who had been planning this moment for a very long time. "You should have stayed in Abilene." Grant did not move. He could not move. His back was against the stone wall of the underground storage room beneath the Briggs Ranch house, and ahead of him stood 4 armed men in the flickering orange light of a single lantern. His own revolver had been kicked across the earthen floor the moment they had pulled him through the trapdoor from above. His deputy's badge caught the lantern light and threw a small star of gold onto the ceiling, and for one absurd moment he thought about how his father had pinned that badge on him and told him that the law was the most important thing a man could serve. His father had not mentioned anything about dying in a cellar. Calhoun Briggs was a broad man, thick through the shoulders and neck, with small pale eyes that held no warmth at all. He was the most powerful landowner in Comanche County, Texas, and he had been running a cattle theft operation across 3 counties for the better part of 4 years. Grant had ridden 5 days from the county seat at Brownwood to expose him. He had ridden into an ambush instead. "You got anyone who knows you are here, Monroe?" Briggs asked, and he almost sounded curious. Grant thought about lying. He thought about the truth. The truth was worse. "No," he said. Briggs smiled. "That is what I thought." And then from somewhere above them in the structure of the house, there came a sound that did not belong. It was not footsteps. It was not a voice. It was a steady, rhythmic creaking, like weight being shifted carefully and deliberately across old floorboards, and it moved in a very specific direction that told Grant, even in the last seconds of his hope, that someone up there knew exactly where they were going. Briggs heard it too. His pale eyes flicked upward. The lantern went out. Grant Monroe had grown up in a small town outside of Waco, Texas, in the year of 1871, when his father was a circuit court judge who believed absolutely in the ordered rule of law and passed that belief on to his son, the way other fathers passed on a talent for carpentry or a good throwing arm. By the time Grant was 22, he had absorbed so much of his father's conviction that it had become indistinguishable from his own character. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of steady brown eyes that people either trusted immediately or found quietly unsettling, depending on which side of the law they stood on. He had worked 2 years as a constable in Waco, then taken a deputy's commission in Comanche County when Sheriff Dale Archer asked him personally in 1879. He was 26 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a reputation for being methodical, thorough, and almost entirely lacking in the gift for self-preservation. That last quality was what had brought him to the Briggs Ranch in the late autumn of 1881. The cattle disappearances had started small. A rancher near the town of Comanche reported missing stock in the spring of that year, and then another, and then a third, and the pattern that emerged when Grant mapped it on paper was not random rustling. It was a systematic operation, hitting specific ranches in a rotation that suggested inside knowledge of pasture layouts and water routes. The stolen cattle were not being sold locally. They were moving south through the broken country toward the Edwards Plateau and disappearing into the chaos of land disputes and conflicting registry records that made ownership verification a nightmare. Grant had followed the paper trail for 6 months. He had ridden to Austin twice to check land records. He had talked to cattle brokers and railroad men and small ranchers who were afraid to give their names. The trail had led, inevitably and unmistakably, to Calhoun Briggs. Briggs owned 40,000 acres in the eastern part of the county and had the local political influence that went with that kind of land. He was a man who had always operated on the edge of legality and had always managed to stay just barely on the acceptable side of it. 3 county commissioners owed him favors. The local newspaper editor had taken money from him in the form of advertising contracts that were conspicuously generous. Sheriff Archer had warned Grant privately that bringing a case against Briggs would require ironclad evidence, because any weakness in the documentation would be exploited by lawyers that Briggs could easily afford. Grant had thought he had that evidence. He had a signed statement from a cattle broker in San Saba, who had unknowingly recorded transactions involving animals that matched the brand descriptions of the missing stock. He had a freight manifest that placed Briggs's ranch foreman at a rail yard in Brady on the exact dates of 2 separate thefts. He had the testimony, sworn and documented, of a young ranch hand named Percy Webb, who had witnessed the loading of stolen cattle onto wagons bearing modified brand marks. What he had not had was the sense to wonder why Percy Webb had come forward so conveniently. Percy Webb, it turned out, worked for Calhoun Briggs. Grant had ridden out to the Briggs Ranch on a Monday morning in November of 1881, intending to deliver a formal notice of investigation and request access to the ranch's brand ledgers under the authority of a court order he had obtained in Brownwood. He had arrived to find the ranch yard suspiciously empty for a working Monday, the main house door standing open, and Percy Webb waiting at the entrance with an apologetic expression and an invitation to come inside and speak with Mr. Briggs directly. It was the oldest kind of trap. Grant had walked into it because he had been so certain of his evidence that he had not properly questioned the circumstances of its source. They had taken his gun in the hallway of the main house, 4 men appearing from side rooms with weapons already drawn, and Briggs had appeared from the back of the house with that satisfied smile and told Grant that he had been expecting him for some time. They had marched him through a door in the kitchen floor, down a ladder into the underground storage room, and that was where he had been standing when Calhoun Briggs pressed a gun to his temple and told him it was the end of the line. And then the lantern went out. The darkness in the cellar was complete and disorienting, and Grant heard the men around him react with confusion, boots shifting on the earthen floor, voices starting to ask questions, and then there was a sound directly above his head that was not the creak of floorboards but something sharper and more purposeful, like the scrape of metal against stone, and a section of the ceiling above him opened. Not the trapdoor through which he had been brought down. A different opening entirely, smaller and positioned in the corner of the cellar, where the stone foundation wall met the older timber framing of the house's original construction. A pale rectangle of outdoor daylight appeared in the corner of the ceiling, and a hand reached down into it, and a voice said, low and absolutely controlled, "Monroe, take my hand, right now." He did not know the voice. He did not question it. He reached up in the dark, found a strong, calloused grip, and was pulled upward with a force that surprised him completely, through the opening and out into the cold November air on the north side of the ranch house, where the foundation met a sloping hillside, and the gap between the original stone cellar ceiling and the later timber addition above it had created a crawl space that was completely invisible from inside the house. Grant came through the opening on his hands and knees and found himself on a narrow hillside shelf of rock and scrub grass behind the house. He got to his feet and turned. Naomi Maddox was already moving. She was perhaps 24 years old, with dark red hair pulled back severely under a worn leather hat, and she was dressed in working ranch clothes, heavy canvas trousers and a flannel shirt under a sheepskin vest, with a pair of leather gloves tucked into her belt. She was not a small woman, but she was not large either. She was the kind of build that came from years of actual physical labor, economical and strong, and she moved across the rocky hillside with a certainty and speed that made Grant, who was 6 feet tall and spent considerable time outdoors, feel briefly clumsy by comparison. In her left hand she carried a short-handled sledgehammer. In her right she held Grant's own revolver. She pressed the revolver into his hand as she passed him. "They will be out of the house in 30 seconds, she said. "Follow me." He followed her. She led him north along the hillside, staying below the ridgeline so they were invisible from the ranch yard, moving through the scrub cedar and limestone outcroppings with a fluency that told him she had been on this specific piece of ground many times before. Behind them, from the direction of the ranch house, they heard shouting, and then the crack of a door being thrown open. Naomi did not run. She moved faster, but she kept her footing sure and her course deliberate, choosing a line through the terrain that Grant quickly understood was not random. She was following a specific route, using the rocks and the cedar breaks as cover, threading between them with calculated precision. He stayed close and matched her pace and did not ask questions. They came over a low ridge and dropped down into a shallow draw where two horses were tied to a cedar post that had been driven into the rocky ground. One was a solid gray quarter horse with full saddlebags. The other was a lean bay that Grant recognized as his own animal, which he had left tied at the ranch house gate when he arrived. She had thought of everything. "Mount up," she said, and pulled the cedar post free of the ground with one hand and tossed it aside, already moving to the gray horse with the familiarity of long ownership. Grant mounted his bay. They rode north out of the draw at a canter and did not slow for a long time. They rode for the better part of an hour before Naomi Maddox finally pulled the gray horse down to a walk and turned to look at him with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction. It was something more measured than either of those things. It was the expression of a person who had planned carefully and was now performing a quick internal assessment of whether the plan had held. "You are not shot," she said. "No," Grant agreed. "That is better than the likely alternative." She pulled a water canteen from her saddlebag and drank from it, then offered it to him. "I watched them take you in. I did not have enough time to get help from town, so I went around the north side of the house. I knew about that crawlspace." "How did you know about it?" She looked at him for a moment before answering, and in that moment he had the strong impression that she was deciding how much to tell him, performing a quick calculation of trust that she was not prepared to shortcut. "I used to work that ranch," she said finally. 3 years ago. I know every inch of that property." He wanted to ask her more about that immediately, because there were about 12 questions that followed from that single statement, but she spoke first. "My name is Naomi Maddox. I have been watching Calhoun Briggs for 8 months. She said it with no particular drama, as if reporting a factual condition. "I know what you were trying to do, Deputy Monroe, and I know how you were betrayed. Percy Webb is Briggs's man, has been for 2 years. Grant stared at her. "You knew about Percy Webb?" "I knew about Percy Webb, and I knew about the modified brand ledger that Briggs keeps in the false bottom of his desk drawer. And I know the names of the 2 cattle brokers in San Antonio who have been moving the stolen stock. And I know which Commissioner Briggs has been paying and how much, and I have documentation for most of it." She said all of this in a tone that was completely matter-of-fact, and she watched his expression with those dark, intelligent eyes, and something in the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. Grant Monroe was not a man who was easily shocked. He had spent 5 years in law enforcement in a region that produced events that would have broken a less steady disposition. But in that moment, sitting on horseback on a scrub cedar hillside in the November wind of Comanche County, listening to this woman systematically outline an investigative case that was substantially more complete and better documented than the one that had nearly gotten him killed, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt genuinely and completely surprised. "Where is this documentation?" he asked, when he trusted himself to ask it calmly. "Somewhere safe," she said. "I will take you to it. But first, I need to know that you are going to use it correctly, because I have been building this case for 8 months and I am not going to hand it to someone who will handle it the way you handled today." That landed squarely and he knew it, and he did not attempt to deflect it. "That is fair," he said. She looked at him for another of those assessing moments and then she nodded. "All right," she said. "Ride with me." Naomi Maddox had come to Comanche County in the spring of 1879. The same year Grant had taken his deputy's commission. though the two of them had not met in that first period. She had come from Kansas, from a small cattle town outside Dodge City where her father, Thomas Maddox, had run a medium-sized ranch operation until his death from fever in 1877. Her mother had died when Naomi was 11, and she had grown up doing the work of the ranch alongside her father and a shifting crew of hired hands, learning by doing, learning everything. What she had learned most thoroughly, and what had set her apart from most of the people she encountered, was surveying. Thomas Maddox had owned a surveying transit and a complete set of chain measurements, and had taught Naomi to use them beginning when she was 13 years old, initially because he needed a reliable assistant for the precision work, and found that she had a natural aptitude for the mathematics and the spatial reasoning that the work required. By the time she was 17, she was conducting independent survey work on neighboring properties for a fee, and by the time she was 20, she had a formal understanding of land law and property documentation that was not common in any gender and was almost unheard of in a young woman on the frontier. When her father died, she had managed the ranch for a year before the combination of unpaid debts and a legal challenge from a neighboring landowner over a disputed boundary had forced its sale. The boundary dispute, she had discovered too late, was based on fraudulent survey documentation that the neighboring landowner had paid someone to produce. She had fought it through 2 levels of legal proceeding and lost both times, not because the law was against her, but because the opposing party had more money and more local influence. That experience had done 2 things. It had given her a comprehensive practical education in how property fraud worked on the Texas frontier, and it had given her a deep and permanent understanding of the relationship between land, documentation, and power. She had come to Comanche County following a specific rumor she had heard in a cattle town south of Abilene about a large ranching operation that was building its holding through a combination of legitimate purchase and systematic theft, and that was using a network of false brand registrations and modified land survey records to make its stolen cattle untraceable. The rumor had the specific texture of something she recognized from her own experience, and she had followed it. She had spent 6 months working as a ranch hand on the Briggs property under a shortened name, calling herself Naomi Maddox, doing fence work and stock management and the heavy physical labor of a working ranch hand, which she could do competently and without standing out. She had used that position to map the property, document the brand modification operations she observed, and identify the key participants in the operation. When she had seen enough and had enough, she had left the Briggs Ranch and taken a position at a smaller operation 2 miles north, owned by a widow named Estelle Cranmer who raised horses and asked no troublesome questions. It was from the Cranmer Ranch that she had been conducting the second phase of her investigation, which involved land record research rather than direct observation, and which was the phase that had produced the most legally significant documentation. Grant Monroe learned all of this over the course of the afternoon as they rode north toward the Cranmer property. Naomi told it to him without embellishment and without seeking sympathy, in the same tone she had used to describe the contents of her case documentation. It was the tone of a person who had processed their personal history thoroughly enough that they could present it as relevant background information without becoming emotional about it. He found this quality both admirable and, in a way he could not immediately articulate, quietly devastating. There was something about the completeness of her self-possession that told him a great deal about what she had been through to achieve it. "The survey records are the strongest evidence," she told him, as the Cranmer Ranch came into view across a long, open pasture, its small house and corrals sitting against a hillside of bare oak trees. "Briggs has been using false survey pegs to move property lines. He acquired 3 parcels of land in the last 4 years that were recorded at significantly larger acreage than their legitimate boundaries. The difference in the recorded versus actual acreage accounts for roughly 12,000 acres of land that is on paper his but actually belongs to neighboring ranchers who do not know they have been shorted. "You can prove this?" Grant asked. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I'm a surveyor, Deputy Monroe," she said. "I can not only prove it, I can demonstrate it. I have run the chains on all 3 disputed parcels. I have the measurements, the bearing calculations, and the original government survey records from the General Land Office in Austin, against which the discrepancies are clear and unambiguous. It is not possible to argue with a complete survey record the way it is possible to argue with the testimony of a cattle broker." He thought about that for a moment. "How much time did that take you?" he asked. 3 months of work in the field and 2 trips to Austin," she said. "I slept in a tent for most of it." He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at the Cranmer Ranch ahead of them, and he was thinking about his own investigation, which had taken 6 months and had ended with a gun barrel against his head. And he was also thinking about this woman's investigation, which had taken 8 months and had ended with her sledgehammering her way through a stone foundation to pull a trapped deputy out of a cellar. "You are better at this than I am," he said. He said it simply because it was true and because he had never seen any point in not acknowledging truth. She was quiet for a moment. "I have more at stake," she said. "Tell me what you mean." She guided her horse through the gate of the Cranmer property before she answered. "I lost my family's land because of a man like Calhoun Briggs," she said. "A man who used false documentation and local influence to take something that was not his. I could not stop it when I was 20. I am 24 now and I know a great deal more, and I am not going to fail to stop it again." They dismounted at the corral, and she pulled the gate shut behind the horses and she turned to face him, and there was in her expression something that was neither anger nor grief, but something that partook of both and had been refined by years of work into a kind of clear, burning determination that Grant found entirely transfixing. "I am sorry about your family's land," he said. "Thank you," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was complete and unhesitant. "Now come inside. I want to show you what I have." The documentation she had assembled was extraordinary. She spread it across Estelle Cranmer's kitchen table, while the widow herself, a small sharp-eyed woman of about 50, set coffee on the iron stove and pretended to be interested in something else. There were survey maps, hand-drawn with the precise hatching and notation of professional cartography, that showed the 3 disputed parcels with their false boundary markers and their correct boundaries superimposed in a different ink color. There were tables of measurement data, columns of figures representing chain lengths and bearing angles, that demonstrated the discrepancies between the recorded surveys and the actual ground truth. There were copies of the brand registration documents she had obtained from the county clerk, annotated with her own notes identifying the inconsistencies. There was a ledger, which she explained she had copied by hand in 2 nights of working by lantern light in the Briggs Ranch house while she was still employed there, which showed cattle transactions in coded notation that she had largely decoded using a key she had found in Briggs's desk. Grant sat at the table for almost an hour, reading through everything, and Naomi sat across from him and answered his questions, and occasionally got up to point out a specific detail in one of the maps. He was, by training and temperament, a careful and methodical reader of evidence. He was not a person who formed rapid conclusions, but by the end of that hour, he was as certain as he had ever been about anything in 5 years of law enforcement work that what he was looking at was a complete, airtight, and professionally executed case against Calhoun Briggs for cattle theft, land fraud, and conspiracy. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough. This would convict him in any court in Texas." "Yes," she said, "I know. Why didn't you take this to the law yourself?" he asked. It was not a critical question. He genuinely wanted to understand. She gave him a look that was patient but not gentle. "I am a woman working as a ranch hand," she said. "A woman who, It would be pointed out within 5 minutes of my opening my mouth in an official proceeding, has no permanent address, no formal credentials, and a personal history that includes a failed property defense that could be characterized as a grievance against large landowners in general. Deputy Monroe, I could walk into the sheriff's office in Brownwood with this documentation, and I would be thanked politely, and then quietly set aside while they decided whether my survey work was reliable and whether my motives were pure. It would take months and Briggs would hear about it, and he would have time to destroy evidence and pressure witnesses and move his operation. She folded her hands on the table. I needed a law enforcement officer who already had standing to bring a formal case, who had already been investigating Briggs through official channels, and who had enough of a legal framework established that my documentation could be submitted as supporting evidence rather than as the entire case brought by an irregular source. He looked at her for a long moment. "You were looking for me," he said. "I was aware that you were investigating Briggs," she said. "I have been watching the situation. I had not identified the right moment to approach you yet. Today's events accelerated my timeline considerably." He almost smiled. "You could say that." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the softening of the sustained professional composure she had been maintaining since she pulled him out of that cellar. And he saw briefly something that might have been the person under the investigator, the 24-year-old woman who had been sleeping in tents and copying ledgers by lantern light and running survey chains across disputed pasture land for 3 months, alone, because she had decided that this was the thing that needed to be done. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked slightly surprised by the question, as if she had not expected it from him, and then she said, "Yes, I am better than I was this morning because you are alive, and that is the preferred outcome." "Thank you for that," he said, "for pulling me out for all of this." "Do not thank me yet," she said. "We still have to get this to a judge before Briggs realizes what I have and comes looking for it." She was right, and they both knew it. Briggs had seen Grant's face and knew a deputy had been investigating him. He would not know yet about Naomi or the documentation, but he was not a stupid man, and once he started pulling at threads, he would reach her name quickly enough. The time they had was not long. Grant sent a message through the Cranmer Ranch's nearest neighbor, who was willing to ride to the telegraph office in Comanche, to Sheriff Archer in Brownwood that night. The message was carefully worded and said enough without saying too much. He requested that Archer come personally and bring Judge Warren Fisk, who was the circuit judge currently sitting in Brownwood, and who was the one man in the regional judicial apparatus that Grant was certain Briggs had not successfully compromised. While they waited for a response, Grant and Naomi spent 2 days at the Cranmer Ranch, and those 2 days were among the strangest and most unexpectedly significant of Grant Monroe's life. The practical work of those days was straightforward enough. They organized and cross-referenced the documentation, Grant drafting a formal officer's report that incorporated Naomi's survey evidence and the copied ledger and the brand registration discrepancies into a coherent legal narrative. Naomi reviewed every word of his drafts with the same precision she brought to her survey calculations, correcting errors of legal description and improving the technical language of the land fraud elements with a confidence and accuracy that made him wonder, more than once, whether she had spent time reading property law in addition to everything else. She had. "I read everything I could find about Texas property law after I lost my father's land," she told him when he asked. "I read the statutes, I read the case records that were available at the county clerk's office, I read the land grant documentation at the general land office. I wanted to understand how it worked." She paused. "I also wanted to understand exactly how it had been used against me and whether there had been anything I could have done differently." "And was there?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Not with what I knew then," she said. "Now, yes, but that is the nature of experience. It arrives after the thing it would have been useful for." They ate their meals at Estelle Cranmer's table, the 4 of them including the widow and occasionally one of the Cranmer horse hands. a quiet old man named Silas who had worked for the widow for 12 years, and regarded the entire situation with the unflappable calm of a man who had lived through enough of the frontier's specific chaos to find a deputy and a ranch hand hiding from a corrupt cattleman mildly unremarkable. In the evenings, after the work was done, Grant found himself sitting on the Cranmer porch talking with Naomi in the cold November dark, and those conversations ranged further and further from the immediate situation in ways that surprised him. She talked about surveying with a passion that was entirely different from the professional composure she brought to the investigative work. When she talked about the mathematics of triangulation, about the process of establishing a fixed datum point, and working outward through a series of measured angles and distances to create an accurate spatial record of a piece of land, her voice changed. It became warmer and more animated. She talked about the way a good survey made the invisible visible, made the abstract fact of land ownership into a concrete, verifiable, legally defensible reality, and how that translation from abstract to concrete was the only real protection a small landowner had against a larger and more powerful one. "Land is everything out here," she said, on the second evening, looking out over the dark pasture. "A man with a deed and a solid survey record has something that the law will protect. Without those documents, the land is just land, and whoever has the money and the connections will take it eventually. My father understood that intellectually. He taught me to survey because he believed in the precision of it, but he trusted people more than the documentation, and when a neighbor offered him a handshake agreement on a boundary question instead of a formal survey, he took the handshake." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not blame him. He was a good man who believed people were fundamentally honest." "Are they?" Grant asked. She looked at him sideways. "The good ones are," she said. "But a handshake does not hold up in a disputed property proceeding. A documented survey chain does." He thought about that, and then he said, "You have a very specific kind of faith, not in people's honesty exactly. More in the capacity of careful documentation to hold people accountable." She considered this for a moment. "That is a generous characterization," she said. "I would say I believe in evidence. Evidence does not care about money or political influence. If you have measured something correctly and recorded it correctly, the measurement is the measurement. It does not change because someone powerful finds it inconvenient." "That is also what I believe," he said, "about the law." She looked at him again, that direct considering look, and this time the corner of her mouth moved definitely in the direction of a smile. "Then we agree about something important," she said. "We agree about several things," he said. "I'm beginning to think we agree about most things." She turned to look at the dark pasture again, but the smile had not entirely left her face. "Do not overreach, deputy," she said. "Grant," he said. "My name is Grant." A pause. "Naomi," she said, as if returning the offer in kind. The response from Brownwood arrived on the morning of the third day, carried by a young rancher who had been deputized temporarily by Archer to ride the message out. Sheriff Dale Archer and Judge Warren Fisk would arrive at the Cranmer Ranch by noon the following day, accompanied by 4 additional deputies, and they would bring the legal authority necessary to execute warrants against Calhoun Briggs and his associates. The message also contained a warning. Archer wrote that he had received a separate communication from Briggs's lawyer in Comanche, requesting that any investigation of Briggs be suspended pending a review of the investigating deputy's conduct, and alleging that Grant Monroe had entered the Briggs property illegally and attempted to remove documents without proper authorization. It was exactly the kind of preemptive legal maneuvering that Naomi had predicted, and it confirmed that Briggs knew he was in danger and was already beginning to build a counter-narrative. "He does not know about my documentation yet," Naomi said, reading the message over Grant's shoulder. "If he did, his lawyer's letter would have been more specific. He knows you were there and that you got away. He does not know how or with whose help." "That advantage will not hold indefinitely," Grant said. "It only needs to hold until tomorrow noon," she said. It held, but only just. That evening, as the sun went down behind the live oak hills to the west, and the temperature dropped sharply with the onset of a November norther, Silas the horse hand came in from the barn with a warning. He had ridden to the south fence line to check on a gate latch and had seen a pair of riders on the road below, moving slowly past the Cranmer property and looking at it with a quality of attention that did not suggest casual travel. "Scouts," Grant said immediately. "Briggs is looking." Naomi did not react with alarm. She was already at the kitchen table, gathering the survey maps and the copied ledger into the oilskin pouch she had brought them in. "The documentation needs to be in a different location," she said. "If they come for it, they cannot be allowed to find it here. Estelle has been generous enough, and I will not put her at risk." She was right, and Grant knew it. He looked at the widow, who was standing by the stove with a steadiness that suggested considerable courage in a small body. "There is a place," Estelle Cranmer said. "The root cellar under the barn. It has a false wall in the northwest corner, behind the potato bins. My late husband built it during the Reconstruction troubles. Nobody who did not know where to look would ever find it." Naomi looked at her with something like gratitude and something like respect. "Show me," she said. They moved the documentation in the full dark of evening, Naomi and Estelle carrying the oilskin pouch through the barn to the root cellar entrance, while Grant and Silas watched the road from the north side of the house. The riders did not appear again that night, but Grant slept lightly, with his revolver on the bedroll beside him, in the Cranmer tack room where he had been quartered. In the morning, he was awake before sunrise. He dressed and walked out to the corral and found Naomi already there, leaning on the fence rail, watching the horses move in the early gray light. She was wearing her sheepskin vest over the flannel shirt, and her hat was pulled down against the cold, and she was very still, in the way of someone who had been standing there long enough to have already had whatever thoughts had driven her out of bed at this hour. He stood beside her at the fence rail and did not speak immediately. The horses moved, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Did you sleep?" he asked eventually. "Some," she said. "Enough." He looked at her profile in the early light, and he was thinking about a number of things simultaneously, which was not his normal condition. He was thinking about the case, because that was the professional thing his mind should be on. He was thinking about the riders on the road. He was thinking about what would happen when Archer and Fisk arrived. And underneath all of those thoughts, like a current under the surface of moving water, he was thinking about Naomi Maddox herself, about the specific quality of her intelligence and her self-possession and her determination, about the way she talked about survey mathematics with a warmth she otherwise kept carefully contained, about the things she had lost, and the way she had turned that loss into the most precise and purposeful kind of action. He was thinking that he had never met anyone quite like her, and that this recognition felt less like a discovery and more like a conclusion he had been moving toward without knowing it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. When this is done," he said, "when Briggs is in custody and the case is made and the court has what it needs, what do you do next?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horses. "I have not thought about it in concrete terms," she said. "I have been thinking about this for so long that I have not given a great deal of consideration to what comes after. It is a habit of focus people. Do you go back to Kansas?" "There is nothing to go back to in Kansas," she said. There was no self-pity in it, pure fact. "Then what?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and her expression was curious and slightly guarded, and he could see her working out what he was actually asking. "What do you want the answer to be?" she said. It was a direct question, and he respected it for what it was. He did not deflect it. "I want the answer to be that you stay in Comanche County," he said. "I want the answer to be that there is work here for someone with your skills, because there is. The county needs a formal surveyor. The land records in this county are a disaster, and everyone who knows anything about property law knows it. You could spend the next decade doing honest, important work, and you would never lack for it." He paused. "I also want the answer to be that you would consent to spending some part of your time in my company." She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and he held her gaze and did not look away, because there was nothing in what he had said that he was not prepared to stand behind completely. "That is two separate propositions," she said. "They are," he said. "You can accept either one independently." The corner of her mouth moved. "You are very careful with your language," she said. "I am a law enforcement officer. Precision matters." She turned back to the horses, and in the silence he could feel her considering it, turning it over with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else, and he waited, because he understood that this was not a question to be answered carelessly or quickly. "I have been alone in this work for a long time," she said finally, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I have been alone for longer than that, really. I learned to work alone because the alternative was to depend on people and find them inadequate to what was needed." She paused. "I am not saying that about you specifically. I did not know you 3 days ago." "You know me now," he said. "A little." "A little," she agreed. "I know that you are honest about your failures, which is more than most men are. I know that when I told you your investigation was flawed, you did not argue or take offense. I know that you read evidence carefully and you form conclusions slowly." She paused again. "I know that you are the only person in 3 months who has asked me if I was all right." He did not speak. "That seems significant," she said. "That last thing." "It seemed like the obvious question," he said. "It is never the obvious question," she said. "That is rather my point." They stood at the fence rail while the light grew and the cold deepened and the horses moved, and it was one of those mornings that the Texas hill country occasionally produced in November, when the sky went from gray to a clear pale gold and the air smelled like cedar and cold stone and distance, and Grant Monroe was aware, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was standing at the beginning of something rather than the end of anything. "Ask me again," Naomi said. "After this is finished." "I will," he said. Sheriff Dale Archer and Judge Warren Fisk arrived at noon with 4 deputies, as promised, and the 2 riders who had scouted the Cranmer Ranch the previous evening were nowhere in evidence. Grant met them at the gate and gave Archer a concise briefing that took 30 minutes and covered the essential facts. Archer listened with the characteristic stoic attention that had made him a good sheriff for 12 years. Fisk, who was a small, dry man with spectacles, and the bearing of someone who had sat behind a bench long enough to find drama of all kinds mildly tiresome, listened to the legal arguments Grant laid out with his hands folded in his lap. When Grant had finished, Fisk asked to see the documentation. Naomi brought it from the root cellar herself, carrying the oilskin pouch into Estelle Cranmer's kitchen and unfolding the survey maps on the table. She presented the case methodically and without nervousness, walking Fisk through the survey evidence first, because it was the most technically demanding, and she wanted to establish her credibility on that ground before moving to the less technical elements. She explained her methodology, her measurement records, the comparison with the General Land Office archives in Austin, and the specific calculated discrepancies that demonstrated the fraudulent boundary placements. Fisk listened without expression through the survey presentation. When she reached the brand registration evidence and the copied ledger, he interrupted her once to ask a technical question about the notation system in the ledger, and she answered it completely and immediately. When she finished, he was silent for almost a full minute. "This is the most thorough private investigation I have encountered in 22 years on the bench," he said. He said it to the room in general rather than to Naomi directly, in the way of men of his generation who found it difficult to address women professionally. But Naomi did not react to this, and Grant noticed that she did not. Fisk signed 3 warrants that afternoon for Calhoun Briggs and his foreman and Percy Webb. The arrests were made the following morning, Archer taking his 4 deputies to the Briggs ranch at sunrise with the warrants in hand. Briggs did not resist. The weight of the documentation, which Fisk had reviewed in full and characterized as compelling and legally sufficient, was clearly visible to Briggs through his lawyer even before the formal proceedings, and the lawyer advised him against a physical confrontation that would add charges to an already serious situation. Grant was not part of the arrest party. His role in the formal documentation of the case was complete, and Archer, with whom he had a long working relationship of mutual respect, had told him plainly that his near death in that cellar had created a technical question about his objectivity that Briggs's lawyer would certainly raise, and that it was better for the case's integrity to have clean hands on the arrest. Grant accepted this without dispute because it was legally sound, and because it gave him a reason to stay at the Cranmer Ranch through the morning of the arrest. He spent that morning helping Silas with fence repair, which was necessary and useful work, and Naomi spent it doing a careful inventory of the survey equipment she had stored at the Cranmer Ranch, cleaning and organizing the transit and the chain measurements with the methodical care of someone who respected good tools. They worked within sight of each other through the morning without speaking much, and it was a comfortable kind of silence, the kind that does not require filling. "They have him," Grant said, when the morning was nearly gone and a rider came from the direction of the Briggs Ranch, with word that the arrests had been executed successfully. Naomi set down the transit leg she had been cleaning and was still for a moment. "Good," she said. Her voice was even, but he could hear something under it, a very quiet release of something that had been held tightly for a long time. He went to her and stood beside her, and he did not say anything because the moment did not need words. She looked at the Cranmer pasture, at the horses in the cold sunlight, and he watched her breathe. After a while she said, 8 months. "I know," he said. "It is strange," she said. "I thought I would feel more triumphant. I mostly feel tired." "That is what it always feels like," he said. "When a long case closes, the triumph comes later. First you feel the weight of how long you were carrying it." She looked at him sideways. "You speak from experience." "Some," he said. "None quite like this." The trial of Calhoun Briggs took place in the district court in Brownwood in March of 1882, 4 months after the arrests. Naomi Maddox testified for 2 full days, presenting her survey evidence and her copies of the ledger and the brand documentation. She was examined closely by Briggs's lawyer, who was a competent Austin attorney named Voss, who attempted several angles of attack on her credibility, questioning her professional credentials, her presence on the Briggs property under a different name, and her personal history involving a prior land dispute, which he characterized as evidence of a bias against large landowners. Naomi answered every question without losing her composure. When Voss questioned her surveying credentials, she produced the survey work she had performed under her own name in Kansas and Texas, including a formal recommendation from a registered surveyor in Wichita who had supervised her work in 1878. When he questioned the reliability of the ledger copies she had made, she produced a comparison with the original ledger, which had been seized in the warrant execution and which matched her copies exactly, line by line. When he raised her personal history, she acknowledged it completely and without defensiveness, and then explained precisely how it had informed her understanding of the specific type of fraud she had been documenting, which had the effect of making the personal history sound less like a grievance and more like relevant professional experience. Judge Fisk, who was presiding, sustained 3 of Voss's objections and overruled the other 11. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Calhoun Briggs received a sentence of 12 years in the state penitentiary. His foreman received 8 years. Percy Webb, who agreed to testify against the others in exchange for consideration, received a sentence of 2 years with the possibility of earlier release for cooperative behavior. The 2 San Antonio cattle brokers were referred to the district courts of Bexar County for their own proceedings. Grant was present in the courtroom for the verdict. He was seated at the prosecution table, having been called as a witness to testify about his investigation and his capture at the Briggs Ranch, though the testimony of the law enforcement participants was secondary to Naomi's documentation. When the verdict was read, he looked across the courtroom to where Naomi was seated in the gallery, and she was looking back at him, and this time the corner of her mouth moved all the way into something that was definitively and completely a smile. He had asked her again, the way he had promised he would in December of the previous year, on a cold, clear evening at the Cranmer Ranch, while the first real norther of winter pushed down from the north, and Estelle Cranmer's fireplace made the front room warm and amber-colored. He had asked her directly and honestly, which was the only way he knew how to ask anything, whether she would consider remaining in Comanche County, and whether she would allow him to court her properly, which in this context meant giving him the opportunity to know her better over time and to let her know him, with no conditions and no expectations beyond his own genuine desire to be in her company as much as she could tolerate. She had been quiet for a long moment, in the way she was always quiet when she was thinking something through completely, and then she had said, with a kind of careful honesty that matched his own, that she had thought about it seriously since their conversation at the corral fence, and that her conclusion was yes to both parts, but that she wanted him to understand what he was agreeing to, which was a woman who worked for her own living and made her own decisions and would not be persuaded to give either of those things up. "I would not ask you to," he said. "Many men say that," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean it." She had looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes. "I believe you do," she said. "That is the unusual thing about you." He had reached across the space between them and taken her hand, and she had let him hold it, and that had been the beginning. In the months between December and the trial, they had seen each other with as much regularity as his work and her survey commissions allowed. She had, in fact, secured formal survey work in Comanche County almost immediately after the arrests, because word of her survey evidence in the Briggs case had spread through the local ranching community quickly, and there were a number of landowners who had been quietly anxious about the state of their own boundary documentation and wanted it formally verified. She worked with the efficiency and thoroughness of a trained professional, which she was, and she turned in survey records that were so meticulously prepared that the county clerk, an older man named Horace Tuttle, who had been doing his job for 16 years and had formed definite views about the reliability of survey work, examined her first submission for 30 minutes and then told his assistant that this was the best documented survey record he had seen since a state-certified surveyor from Austin had come through in 1876. When Grant was in the county seat at Brownwood, which was roughly half his time, they had dinner together on evenings when she was there, and he was not working. When he was out in the county on enforcement work, they wrote letters, which Grant found he was looking forward to more than almost any other regular feature of his schedule. Her letters were characteristically direct and intelligent, full of observations about the land she was surveying, and the people she was meeting, and the occasional absurdity of frontier life, written in a clear, even hand with the same precision she brought to survey notation. He wrote her about his work, about the cases he was handling, about the things he saw in the county, and occasionally, with increasing frequency, about how he was thinking about the future, in specific terms rather than vague ones. She was careful with the emotional dimensions in a way that was consistent with everything he had learned about how she operated. She did not respond to his expressions of feeling with equal expressions of her own, not at first. She responded with intelligence and honesty, and a quality of attention that told him she was taking it seriously, which was, for Naomi Maddox, the highest form of engagement. But she also wrote him, in a letter in January, that she had found herself, for the first time in a long time, looking forward to a specific future rather than simply working toward an abstract goal, and that she thought he was responsible for this difference, and that it unsettled her in a way she found she did not entirely mind. He had read that paragraph 4 times and then carried the letter in his coat pocket for a week. After the verdict in March, they rode back to Brownwood together from the courthouse, and he told her what he had been composing in his mind since the previous December, which was that he loved her, not in the impetuous way of a short acquaintance, but in the way of someone who had watched another person operate at the full capacity of their intelligence and their courage under genuine pressure, and had recognized with absolute certainty that this was a person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. He said it on the road outside of town, with the March wind coming across the hills and the cedar brakes dark green against the pale winter sky, and she stopped her horse and looked at him for a long, complete moment. "I love you too," she said. She said it with the same directness she brought to a survey reading or a legal argument, without hesitation and without decoration, and it was the most honest and therefore the most affecting declaration he had ever heard. "I have known it for some time. I wanted to be certain before I said it." "How certain are you?" he asked. "Completely," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand the way he had taken it at the Cranmer Ranch fireplace, and she held it, and they sat on the road outside Brownwood for a minute in the March wind while the certainty of it settled over both of them like something the land itself had decided. "I want to ask you something else," he said. "You are going to ask me to marry you," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me properly," she said, and the smile was fully present now, not contained or measured but entirely real. He dismounted from his horse and stood on the road and looked up at her. "Naomi Maddox," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him from horseback with her hat brim against the sky and her face open and bright in the March light, and she said, "Yes, Grant Monroe, I will." He got back on his horse and she leaned across and kissed him, and it was the best moment of his life up to that point, which was saying something, because his life had contained a number of good moments. They were married in June of 1882 in the county seat at Brownwood, with a ceremony conducted by Judge Fisk, who brought to it the same dry precision he brought to legal proceedings, and managed, despite this, to produce a ceremony that was honest and dignified and moved Estelle Cranmer, who was present, to tears of a happy variety. Sheriff Archer stood with Grant. Silas, who had driven the Cranmer buggy 30 miles to be present, sat in the front row and wore his good hat, which turned out to be a very fine piece of work that nobody had suspected he possessed. Naomi wore a dress that she had bought in Austin, dark blue with small ivory buttons, and she wore her hair down for the occasion, which Grant had not seen before, and he found it so unexpectedly affecting that he spent the first 30 seconds of the ceremony slightly unable to concentrate on what Fisk was saying. She noticed this, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that told him she had anticipated exactly this reaction, and found it entirely satisfactory. They established themselves in Brownwood, Grant continuing his deputy's work and Naomi building her surveying practice, which grew steadily through the second half of 1882 into something that was clearly going to be a significant professional enterprise. She took on a second employee by autumn, a young man of 20 named Thomas Hill who had some mathematical education and enough physical stamina for field work, whom she trained with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. They bought a house on the edge of town, a solid limestone construction with a good front porch and a workshop behind it where Naomi kept her surveying equipment and her maps. They planted a kitchen garden in the first spring, and it produced generously because Naomi applied the same systematic precision to soil preparation that she applied to everything else. The early years of their marriage had the quality of a life being built carefully and well. They were not without difficulties. Grant's work brought him into contact with danger with a regularity that was simply the nature of frontier law enforcement, and there were cases that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. And there were nights when Naomi lay awake in the limestone house, listening to the wind in the live oaks and thinking about cellars and gun barrels. She told him this honestly, because they had established from the beginning that honesty was the condition of their partnership, and he heard her and took her concerns seriously and was more careful than he had been before he had someone specific to be careful for. She was not without her own professional difficulties. Survey work in a region with disputed land records was inherently contentious, and there were clients who accepted her professional conclusions and clients who did not. And the ones who did not sometimes made that disagreement personal in ways that required her to maintain the same composure and precision she had brought to the Voss cross-examination in the Briggs trial. She was good at this. She was also good at the quieter professional politics of establishing herself in a field and a region that had not previously included a woman of her specific capabilities, which required a combination of competence and patience that she had in full measure. Grant watched her navigate this with an admiration that deepened with every year of marriage into something that was less like wonder at discovering a capacity he had not expected, and more like the ongoing pleasure of watching a person of genuine quality do what they were built to do. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, a boy they named Thomas after Naomi's father, who arrived in the world with a healthy pair of lungs and the dark hair of the Monroe side of the family. Grant sat with Naomi through the labor in the limestone house, because she had asked him to and because there was nowhere he would have considered being. And when Thomas arrived and was placed in his arms while Naomi rested, he looked at his son and felt the specific expansion of the human heart that is not possible to describe in accurate terms, and which made every other strong feeling he had ever had seem like a preliminary exercise. Naomi watched him holding Thomas, and there was in her expression a quality of satisfaction that was different from any kind he had seen in her before, warmer and less guarded, and entirely without the precision she normally brought to her emotional expressions, and he thought it might be the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Thomas Hill, who had been promoted to lead assistant at the survey practice and had developed a genuine professional competence under Naomi's training, managed the survey work during the month she took from it after Thomas was born, and she was back at the transit and chain measurements before the summer was out, carrying Thomas with her to the office building she had leased on the main street and eventually to mild field work as he grew old enough to be portable. The years turned in the way that good years do, with work and weather and the particular texture of a life that has been built on solid ground. The survey practice continued to grow. Naomi took on a formal apprentice in 1886, a young woman of 19 named Clara Hewitt, whose father was a county clerk, and who had the same combination of mathematical aptitude and physical capability for field work that the job required. Naomi trained her with the same methodical care, and had the quiet satisfaction of watching someone else learn what she had learned from her father and turn it into something of their own. Grant was promoted to sheriff of Comanche County in 1886, when Dale Archer retired to a small ranch outside of Comanche town. The appointment was not automatic. There was a political process and there were other candidates, and Briggs's old political network, which had not entirely dissolved with its patron's imprisonment, made some noise about the suitability of the man who had brought Briggs down. But the majority of the county's ranching community knew exactly what had happened in 1881, or at least knew enough of it, and the combined reputation of Grant Monroe and Naomi Maddox, which had grown through 5 years of honest and visible professional work, was more than sufficient to carry the appointment. Grant accepted the sheriff's badge from the county commissioners in November of 1886, 5 years almost to the month from the day he had been pulled out of a cellar by a woman with a sledgehammer and a better understanding of the case than his own, and he wore it with the same conviction his father had taught him, and a good deal more specific wisdom about the ways in which law and land and power intersected in the real world. A second child arrived in 1887, another boy, William, who had red hair that was unmistakably from the Maddox side, and a temperament that was forthright and questioning from the very beginning, crawling into everything he could reach and examining it with an intensity that made Grant laugh and made Naomi say, in a tone that was equal parts affectionate and resigned, that she recognized that quality. Estelle Cranmer came to visit twice a year, and treated Thomas and William as something functionally equivalent to grandchildren, which she was well suited to, and they were enthusiastic recipients of. Silas, who was no longer working the horse operation, but had accepted a small regular payment from the Cranmer widow in exchange for keeping the corrals and doing light maintenance, was well, and had nothing negative to report about his condition when asked. Grant kept in regular contact with Judge Fisk, who had continued his circuit work, and had occasion to pass through Brownwood several times a year. Fisk, to Grant's quiet amusement, had developed a professional respect for Naomi's survey work that occasionally crossed into what might be called admiration, and he had cited her documentation in 2 subsequent property fraud cases as an example of the standard of evidence that made land disputes genuinely adjudicable. In 1888, Naomi received a formal appointment as an official surveyor of record for Comanche County, the first woman to hold such a position in the county's history, and one of a very small number in the state. The appointment came through the county commissioners, on the recommendation of the county clerk's office, which had been working with her documentation for 6 years, and had developed a very clear opinion of its quality. She came home from the commissioners' meeting on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and found Grant on the front porch with Thomas, who was 4 and engaged in the serious business of teaching a barn cat to remain stationary through the application of gentle, persistent negotiation. "It is official," she said. Grant looked at her from the porch steps, and the expression on his face was one she had come to know over 6 years of marriage, which was the expression that meant he was genuinely and specifically proud in the way that required him to work to keep it from showing too completely, because showing it too completely might look excessive. "County surveyor," he said. "Surveyor of record," she said. "The distinction matters for the certification of property boundaries in disputed proceedings." "I know it does," he said. "Come here." She went up the porch steps, and he put his arm around her, and she stood in the October afternoon with her husband's arm around her and her son, determinedly negotiating with a barn cat at their feet, and the live oaks turning gold on the hillside above the town, and she felt, completely and without reservation, the specific quality of contentment that comes from a life that has been built correctly. She thought briefly, as she sometimes did, about her father, about the morning she had stood in a Kansas county courthouse and heard a judge rule against her and understood that the land was gone. She thought about the shape of that loss and the years of work that had followed it, the tent survey camps and the lantern-lit ledger copying and the cellar and the gun barrel and the November hillside and all the rest of it, the long purposeful arc of it, and she thought about where it had brought her. "I want to show you something," she said. She went inside and came back with a survey map, one she had been working on for several weeks in the evening hours after the boys were in bed. She spread it on the porch railing and smoothed it flat. It was a complete survey of the Cranmer property, prepared as a formal survey record with all the measurement documentation that made it legally defensible. Estelle Cranmer was getting older and had expressed, on her last visit, some quiet anxiety about the status of the property documentation, which had never been updated since her husband's death. "I want to give this to Estelle," Naomi said, "properly documented and filed with the county record, so that the land is protected." Grant looked at the map, at the precise notation and the careful measurement records, and he looked at his wife. "It is good work," he said. "It is the most important kind," she said. "A person should not have to be afraid that the land they have worked will be taken from them because the documentation is inadequate. That fear should not be part of life. Not for Estelle, not for any of the small landowners in this county." He thought about all the things she had done that fell under that description, the 8 months of investigation, the 3 months of field survey work, the 2 trips to Austin, the cellar, and all the years of building a practice that had given the county's small landowners the kind of property documentation they deserved. "You know what you are," he said. She looked at him with a hint of amusement. "What am I?" "The best thing that ever happened to Comanche County," he said. "And to me," She looked at him for a moment with those dark, intelligent eyes, and then she folded the survey map and tucked it under her arm and kissed him with a straightforwardness and warmth that was entirely characteristic of her. And Thomas abandoned his project with the barn cat to look at his parents with an expression of mild interest. "You are embarrassing yourself in front of our son," she said. "Thomas does not mind," Grant said. "Do you, Thomas?" Thomas considered this question with the seriousness of a 4-year-old. "No," he said, and went back to the barn cat. The October afternoon held them there on the porch, Grant and Naomi, the survey map and the sheriff's badge and the barn cat and the boy and the live oak hillside, and all the years of a life they had built together from the specific materials that each of them had brought to it. Her precision and his steadiness, her independence and his respect for it, her knowledge of the land and his knowledge of the law, and the shared conviction, which had been the ground under all of it from the very beginning. That evidence was the most important thing. That careful documentation and honest accounting were what held the world together against the constant pressure of the dishonest and the powerful. In 1889, a third child arrived, a girl they named Margaret, and she came into the world in the limestone house in November, the same month the whole story had begun, and Naomi looked at her daughter in the lamplight and thought that some months were simply better than others for the things that mattered. Grant told Thomas and William about their new sister in the morning, sitting them down at the kitchen table in the way of a man who believed in presenting important information clearly and directly. And Thomas received the news with the thoughtful consideration of a 5-year-old processing a significant data point. And William, who was 2, said "baby," with an enthusiasm that implied he had been expecting one for some time, and was gratified by the delivery. The Briggs case was settled in law and in memory. The 3 neighboring ranchers whose land had been fraudulently surveyed had their correct boundaries restored through a formal county proceeding in which Naomi's survey work served as the controlling documentation. The cattle brokers in San Antonio were convicted in their own proceedings. Percy Webb served his sentence and left the county and was not heard from again. The survey practice grew and continued to grow. Clara Hewitt became a fully qualified surveyor in her own right by 1891, with her own equipment and her own clients, and she and Naomi maintained a professional relationship that was also, by that point, a genuine friendship. The county's land records became, over the course of the decade, some of the most thoroughly documented in that part of Texas, a fact that the county clerk cited with evident pride in the annual report he submitted to the state land office. Grant served as sheriff for 14 years, until 1900, when he chose not to seek another term, not from any failure of ability or will, but from a considered decision that his family deserved the portion of his time that law enforcement had been consuming for 2 decades, and that there were other capable people to serve in that capacity now. He retired to the limestone house and the front porch, and an involvement in county civic affairs that was substantial but did not require him to be away from home for weeks at a time, and he found this transition surprisingly easy, because the home he was returning to was the one that Naomi Maddox Monroe had built, which was the most interesting and substantive environment he had ever inhabited. She was still working. She would be working for a long time yet. She was completing a comprehensive survey of the county's school section lands, a project commissioned by the state's Public School Endowment Trust, which was the largest single survey commission anyone in the county had ever received, and which she pursued with the same focused thoroughness that had characterized everything she had ever done, rising early and staying late, and filling notebooks with the precise accumulated measurements of a piece of Texas that was slowly, accurately, being rendered fully known. On a winter evening in 1901, 20 years to the month from the November when Grant had ridden into a trap and been pulled out of a cellar by a woman with a sledgehammer and a better case than his own, they sat together on the front porch of the limestone house, which they had added to over the years, until it was a substantial and comfortable place, with a stone addition on the north side and a veranda across the front, and the workshop behind where the survey equipment lived. Thomas was in Austin studying law. William was at the Cranmer Ranch, which he had taken over from Estelle after the widow's quiet death in 1897, running it as a horse operation with a competence that would have made the old widow proud, and did make his parents proud. Margaret was 17, and showed every sign of the same mathematical inclination her mother possessed, and had spent 2 summers in the field with Naomi as an apprentice, and was at that age when the future is beginning to take a specific shape. The winter evening had the particular quality that only the Texas hill country produced, cold and clear, and so quiet that the stars seemed close enough to be a physical presence, and the live oaks on the hillside above the house were still and dark against the sky. Naomi had her notebook open on her lap, which was not unusual, but she was not writing in it. She was looking at the stars, which was less usual. Grant was sitting beside her in the second of the 2 matching chairs that had occupied that section of the porch for 15 years, wearing his good coat against the cold, and he was looking at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thinking about that cellar," she said. "So am I," he said. She turned to look at him. "Are you?" "Sometimes," he said, not with fear, more with gratitude. "If you had not been watching that property, if you had not known about the crawlspace." "I was the one who had the information," she said. "You were the one who was necessary to use it. Without you, without the legal authority and the official standing, 8 months of work would have been very well-documented private knowledge and nothing more." "We needed each other," he said. "We did," she said. "We do." He reached across and took her hand, the way he had taken it on the corral fence in November of 1881, and she held it, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built together in the winter dark of the Texas hill country and listened to the quiet. "I have something I want to say," she said. "Say it," he said. She turned to look at him, and in her expression there was none of the professional composure, none of the measured precision, none of the careful self-containment that had been the necessary armor of a woman building a serious life in a world that had not always been generous to serious women. There was only Naomi, clear and warm and entirely present. "I am glad you were terrible enough at your own investigation that you needed to be rescued," she said. He laughed, which was the correct response, and she laughed with him, and it was the sound of 20 years of a life that had been built well and honestly, and with full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth, and it rose into the cold winter air above the limestone house and the live oak hillside, and the county that they had both, in their different ways, spent the best years of their lives in service to. Inside the house, Margaret was at the kitchen table working on a mathematics problem, and the lamp was lit, and the smell of supper was still in the air, and the front door was open just enough that Grant could hear the scratch of his daughter's pencil and feel the warmth coming out, and he thought that this was the thing, this specific confluence of sounds and warmth and the woman beside him and the work they had done, and that there was nothing more or better that a man could ask from his life than to have arrived at exactly this. Naomi closed her notebook and set it on the porch rail and leaned back in her chair and looked at the stars, and in the quiet she said, "It is a very good county." "It is," he said. "It is better documented than it was," she said, with a quality of satisfaction that was both professional and personal and entirely her own. "Significantly better," he agreed. The stars held their positions above the Texas hill country, fixed and measurable, and the 2 of them sat together in the November dark, bound by 20 years of work and love and the specific conviction they had always shared, that the careful and honest accounting of the world was the most important kind of service a person could render, and that it was better rendered together than alone. The case was closed. The land was documented. The county was safe. The family was well. Grant Monroe took his wife's hand and held it in the cold, and she held his back, and the night was long and clear and full of the kind of quiet that only comes to people who have earned it.